Hey guys, it's been a while, sorry about that, but I had a really terrible idea and that almost always makes for a good video, so here we are. See, today is the Friday after Thanksgiving here in the US, and I got this kooky idea, wouldn't it be fun to put up some of those RGB pixel computerized LED Christmas lights that everybody raves about? So I went looking where else but YouTube for information on the topic, and I came across this. This is Keith. Keith knows what he's talking about. He's one of the guys who's primarily responsible for a piece of software called X-Lights. More about that later. And the short version is this video that he's got going right here is all about how, frankly, it's probably too late to start anything serious for this year. And if you must, here's some advice. Do this, don't do that, whatever. Now, if I'm certain of anything, I am certain that Keith knows what he's talking about and that his recommendations are solid and they are advice that should be followed. None of which has ever stopped me from doing what I was planning to do anyway in the past. Meaning this project has a probably better than 50% chance of being a train wreck, but what would the holidays be without a disaster? So let's get cracking. Rule number one on Keith's list, do not use cheap, imported eBay Chinese LEDs. I have 1,000 of them. Let's build some frames to put them in. No time to make complicated props for these LEDs, so I'm ripping down some 2x8s into strips that I can use to make frames to hold the lights around the windows. This won't give a very three-dimensional effect, but it's quick, it's easy, and it's something that's reusable year after year on this house, or frankly any other, as long as the windows are close to the same size. All right, so with Josh's help, I was able to get all of these cut pieces clamped up into something. I'm gonna let these sit for 24 hours at least, and I'm gonna turn on the space heater in here. Gonna try and dry these things out and see what we end up with. The dry time lets me pick out the straight stock from the stuff that insisted on pretzeling as it dried out. I went through each piece and marked an X on both ends so that I would know where to cut away for some half-lap joints. A magnet makes a pretty good stop block on the iron table of the bandsaw. The cross-grain cut is better done at the table saw, preferably using a sled and a simple clamp for a stop block here. Just remember to flip the piece end for end and not over when you turn it, or you'll cut your half-laps on the wrong side. And then comes the drilling. A whole lot of hole drilling. There's a center hole marked in each one of the pieces, set with a center punch, that the drill bit will largely find its own way into. It's pretty critical to get this hole in the right spot because you're going to use it to index all the rest of them. For the rest of the holes, I made a jig. There's a hardwood dowel that goes through the previous hole to space the next one, and a stop block to make sure that the drill press is always drilling right in the center of my board. After most of the holes are drilled, the frames can be assembled. Here again, the half-lap seems like a good choice. It goes together relatively quickly, is basically self-squaring, and in this case can be held together mostly with pins, although I did throw a spring clamp on there. After the glue dries in some black paint, I can drill out the corner holes by hand. Yes, I'm drilling through the pins, and no, I don't care. Well, installing the pixels into the frame couldn't be a whole lot simpler. You just untwist the wire and shove them in there. The one thing you do want to watch is your starting point. In my case, because I'm doing Windows, I essentially have lefts and rights to keep the data connections between frames as short as possible. So I got to watch which corner I start at on the bottom. Your layout, your setup's going to be different. Just pay attention to it so you don't end up stringing those data wires further than you have to. The other thing that is going to happen to you is that the number of lights in a string is not going to match whatever you're trying to set up, unless you're purposely building a mega tree or something specifically designed to fit the strings. No worry though, these are individually addressable, so you can cut these strings anywhere you need to. I'm kind of alternating back and forth between taking a second new string and using the clips to extend, but then I'm left with more than half of a string. So on the next frame, I'll have to cut the connectors off and splice them together. This is an outdoor project in a western Pennsylvania winter, so splice means solder and then heat shrink tubing, each and every joint. At the corners where the string starts and ends, there are actually 3 power wires, 3 ground wires, and 2 signal wires, 1 data in and 1 data out. It's important that you get all of the pluses spliced together and all of the minuses spliced together. Otherwise, you're going to end up feeding power unevenly to the string, and you'll get weird colors on the lights furthest away from your joint. And then finally, I crimp on a female connector for data in and a male connector for data out. The frames are held into the windowsills by a magnet which attaches to the steel I-beam at the top of the window frame, and then the bottom has feet, which consist of a T-nut that I pressed into place with an F-style clamp and a stainless steel screw that comes down from the top. The magnet actually does most of the holding. And with the first frame complete, it's time for a test fit in one of the first floor windows that I can actually reach. All right, well, I needed a 1/4 inch longer bolt to not have to use shims for this, and I got one brick that sticks into the window frame more than the rest of them. Required a little persuasion to get past it, but by and large, pretty successful. This thing will hang from just the magnet, so there's really no pressure on these screws. They're just enough to keep it from flopping around, which means it's not under compression and should stay nice and straight and tight in here. So as great as the frames are for the windows, for irregular shapes like this door, I decided not to build them because, frankly, it was going to take too long, and some of these spans are just too far for thin pieces of wood. You really are either going to need something beefy, or you're going to need metal, PVC, something like that to keep it from bending. Enter this stuff. This is plastic. It's relatively cheap. It's a couple of $2 or $3 for an 8-foot section, and you can get it pre-drilled on 2, 2.5, 3, whatever inch centers you need to make it fit in with whatever other things that you build. Now, this obviously doesn't have the rigidity of a solid frame, so you have to do things like run horizontal supports, in my case with magnets to attach them to the steel I-beams, and weight them down at the bottom with logs to get them to sit flat. But it does save you all of the trouble of mostly just drilling the holes, frankly. But it can be cut with regular tin snips or scissors, can be wire tied together. You can, as you can see, put up a lot of lights in a relatively short time. Of course, once all the lights are up, somehow you have to power and control them. In my case, I have 2 of these weatherproof enclosures. Each one has a 350 watt 5-volt power supply and 1 or 2 of these ESP8266 microcontroller modules. That microcontroller is particularly well suited to this because somebody already wrote all the code. I set my controllers up on a piece of proto board so that I could put some terminals in for the wiring, add a fuse, and just make mounting it to the case simpler. But I didn't have to write a single line of code for it. Let's go inside, I'll show you where that comes from. You should know before I get into this that I'm about to violate another rule on Keith's list, and that is to roll my own controllers for these lights. He suggests, and frankly I agree, that the smart thing to do is to go with a pre-made commercial solution to this problem, something like a Falcon controller. He describes the process of building and using these ES Pixel sticks, for instance, as fiddly. And I can't argue with that. You'll see when we get into it. There's a couple of steps here, but it's pretty straightforward. In my experience, it's been fairly reliable, and it probably cost me some time, but it's not a choice I regret. So here's the home for the software, forkini.com, the ES Pixel stick. Now, the way this thing is set up, you're supposed to go out and get a particular small variant of the 8266 microcontroller and drop it onto a board, the design of which is right here. And if you plan ahead and do it early in the season, you can actually order kits for this board from Amazon. They unfortunately are out of stock at this point, and they're not going to get any more soon enough for it to be helpful to me, which is why I went with the other version of the microcontroller that I could just use kind of as is. So there's some good info here about exactly what this Pixel stick is for, what it does, some demo videos, and then down towards the bottom are the 2 important links. They're kind of out of order, if you ask me. You need to go to the manual first, because the manual is where you will find all the instructions for how to get the code from the source repository and onto the microcontroller. There's an easy way and there is a hard way, and you can pick for yourself which one you want to grind through. Once you've sorted out all of that stuff, the actual code is hosted over here on GitHub, and there are an assortment of builds here that are kind of more recent than the actual latest release version of the firmware. I'm not sure what has changed in those newer builds, but I stuck with the released firmware, just because I'm on a timeline here and I didn't have the inclination, frankly, to fool around with a work in progress. Once the Pixel Stick firmware is up and running on your 8266, it presents a web interface to whatever Wi-Fi network you set it up for. And that's how you get in and manipulate this thing. You don't have to actually edit the code and recompile it and all that fun stuff, which is beautiful. The only thing that's really important in here beyond the network settings is this device setup tab, where you're going to tell the Pixel Stick what kind of LEDs you have. In my case, I have WS2811s, that's the default, and how many of them. This is the Pixel Stick that's connected to that wreath I built years ago, which happens to have 140 pixels in it. The other setting that's important in here is the universe number. Not going to get into a whole discussion of how universe addressing works with these LEDs, but short version is there are, I believe, 65,535 possible universes that could contain pixels, and you have to tell this Pixel Stick which ones are you. So you do that by specifying a starting universe. In this case, this is IP address .100, so I told it to start at universe 100 just so I keep things straight in my head, and then it figures out how many universes it's responsible for based on the pixel count. Okay guys, home stretch on the computer, I promise. The last piece of software, and arguably the most important, is this program called a sequencer. Now, there are two that are really common out there in the open source space. One is called Vixen, and the other, this one, is called X-Lights. We don't have time to get into a whole tutorial on X-Lights and sequencing, and there's plenty of good information on YouTube about that already anyhow. I just wanted to show you the sort of the critical last step here, which connects the computer all the way to the lights, which is to come into the setup tab on the sequencer and tell it about all four of the Pixel Sticks that I deployed out there. So in essence, this is the screen where you tell the computer program that's going to make the lights dance what lights you have and what IP address each particular set of lights is sitting on. Once you're done with your show, the computer will send the appropriate data over the network to the Pixel Sticks, and really all the Pixel Stick is doing is pulling out the data for one set of LEDs and blasting it down the wire. Okay, I know that's a whirlwind tour of what seems like a pretty complicated setup end to end. My apologies to those of you who were looking for more detail, but the reality is these videos can only be so long. If you don't count the time that I spent waiting for the pixels themselves to be shipped here all the way from China, which was 3 or 4 weeks, I went from 0 to what you're about to see in a week, maybe 8 or 9 days total. Took a while for the paint to dry. I don't know when I'm going to get around to editing so that you can see this video, but the lights were basically up and functional by the beginning of December. That's not too bad considering I did this about as cheaply as it can be done. I shelled out a little extra for good quality power supplies and for nice enclosures to keep everything safe outside. But other than that, I went the discount route and I still think it turned out okay. I have about half a dozen songs sequenced at this point, but of course they're all copyrighted music that I can't put on YouTube. I did find one Creative Commons tune that I thought was pretty nice, so I put a sequence together. I'm going to leave you guys with that. Please check out the description for links to the artist. Many thanks to him for providing the music under that license. And most of all, a Merry Christmas to you and yours. It's been a great year. Thanks for riding along. Everything else I'm doing is a Christmas present for somebody, so you won't see it until 2019. Until then, as always, stay safe, YouTube, and happy holidays.